As high achievers, it is common for us to want to do well in anything we put our minds to. But when you step into a new role, it is really hard to perform at your best because there's a lot to learn. It is very common for imposter syndrome to show up at this juncture. In this week's episode of The Happy Leader, I'm going to talk to you about that imposter syndrome that shows up when we step into a new role, what you can do about it, and how to get yourself back to a more confident place. Welcome to The Happy Leader. I'm Amy Sanchez, executive coach to some of the most innovative leaders and teams in Silicon Valley. I'll share stories and tips to help you navigate the most common leadership challenges so you can amplify what matters most: happiness. Today on The Happy Leader, we're tackling a silent yet pervasive struggle many leaders face: imposter syndrome. In particular, imposter syndrome when we've stepped into a new role and that sneaky, snarky, uninvited voice inside our head that chides us saying, "You don't deserve to be here." To start, let's give this unwelcome yet strangely familiar visitor a definition. Imposter syndrome is a psychological pattern where an individual doubts their role and their accomplishments and has an internalized fear of being exposed as a fraud. If you've ever experienced that, let me just normalize this for you. You are not alone. In fact, it may surprise you to hear that imposter syndrome is incredibly common among successful people. According to HBR, Harvard Business Review, 70% of adults report experiencing imposter syndrome at some point in their life. That's the majority of adults. Some really big household names who we commonly consider successful have reported experiencing imposter syndrome at some point in their career. Just to name a few: Sheryl Sandberg, Tom Hanks, Maya Angelou, Howard Schultz, the Starbucks CEO, and the list goes on. Now, I want to debunk a myth about imposter syndrome that has been out there for quite some time. We often hear this term used and ascribed as a challenge experienced primarily by women. In fact, as you study the roots of the discovery of imposter syndrome, it was a study conducted in the 1970s centered on women. I'm here to tell you that both genders experience imposter syndrome. I personally believe that women are just more open in sharing their struggles, which is why we've commonly associated imposter syndrome with women. But recent research and my own personal experience coaching over 750 leaders has shown me that imposter syndrome happens to both genders. No one is immune. Why does this sneaky visitor tend to show up when we're starting a new role? Well, it's because when we get promoted, we stretch ourselves. We've just gone from a role that we knew well and mastered to a new challenge. It's kind of like back when you were a high school senior, you felt like you were on top of the world. You knew everybody knew you. And then you stepped into your first year as a freshman in college and you suddenly were demoted to the bottom of the totem pole. Very similar to what happens when we step into a new role. In coaching, we also refer to this imposter syndrome as a gremlin, a tiny voice that can subconsciously hold us back from truly shining, until one day we tell that voice to take a hike. Today's story from the Silicon Valley archives is going to highlight just how effective that strategy can be in helping you overcome imposter syndrome. This story is about a newly promoted tech leader at a well-known company here in the Bay who hired me to help him as he stepped into a newly appointed leadership role. It was a very senior leadership role. Let's call him Dave. Dave was a really smart, well-educated, and knowledgeable person. He was also likable and empathetic. But this new promotion made him question if he knew enough about leadership to be successful. He did something that a lot of people do when they step into new roles. He compared himself to his peers, and when he did that, he felt inadequate. He hired me to help him up his leadership game. We got right to work, and I started where I always do, by first helping him better understand himself. I played a little trick on him. Well, it's not really a trick. It's a well-known coaching technique, but here's how it played out. Every time he started to tell me what was missing and why he wasn't ready or qualified for his new leadership role, I asked him to tell me about his past successes. I invited him to share his top strengths with me, how he liked to manage his team, and what he found valuable and important in the work he did. What made him different in a good way from those around him? Over time, this inquiry and reflection helped him retrain his mind. Instead of being hyper-focused on what he didn't have, he started to tune into what he did have. And that bucket was brimming. Dave went from wanting to hire a leadership coach and enroll in an executive leadership program and buy a whole new professional wardrobe to slowly returning to the patterns that had brought him success in his last role, which were learning all the key players, getting up to speed on the new language around him, immersing himself in the strategy, and getting to know his team on a personal and professional level, and learning what was important to help motivate each one of them, setting their strategy and goals so they could focus on the right things to move the needle. Over time, the same techniques that had made him successful in his past role made him successful in his new senior leadership role. And the desire that he initially started with, that imposter syndrome that led him to think that he needed a whole new leadership training program, he needed a whole new wardrobe, suddenly didn't feel as important anymore. And in fact, that, particularly the wardrobe piece, felt inauthentic. He was getting really good results just leveraging the tactics that had already worked for him in the past. As time went on, Dave started to feel more at ease, more confident, and even started celebrating his differences. He even showed up differently on camera when we met. He started, when in the beginning, he would hang his head and he looked very pale. By the end of our time together, he was self-assured, he was sitting up straighter, and the color had returned to his face. This also started showing up in external ways. For example, he got invited to more strategic leadership discussions, and he was even being asked to speak at conferences. He was being tapped as a thought leader. His ship had arrived, and he didn't need to go out to recreate a whole new persona to go along with it. It turns out the person that he was more than enough. He just had to recognize everything he had at his disposal, apply the same playbook that he'd used before, and remember to be mindful about what he did have as opposed to being hyper-focused on what he thought he was missing. If you can relate, here are 3 things that you can do to help you drop off your unwelcome imposter syndrome passenger at the front door. The first thing is just to recognize that you're not alone. Acknowledging that imposter syndrome is a common experience can be incredibly liberating. It happens to the most talented professionals. You've arrived, and your brain just needs time to catch up, but don't get lost in the mirage. To put really specific steps to helping you reframe how you're thinking about yourself in this new role, the first thing to do is to seek feedback. Engage with your peers and your mentors and really gain a realistic perspective about your contributions and strengths. It's likely if you're experiencing imposter syndrome that you're hyper-focused on what you believe you don't have, and unbiased sources or biased sources who really believe in you and have been exposed to your talent can help balance your viewpoints again. Second, set realistic expectations for yourself. Perfection is an impossible standard. Focus on progress, not perfection. You're not going to get it right perfect straight out of the gate, so don't expect yourself to. Some of the power of learning comes from making mistakes along the way. If you want a playbook that can help you, I highly recommend the book, The First 90 Days by Michael Watkins. It will tell you exactly where to focus your efforts so you don't have to doubt yourself along the way. Third thing to do to get rid of this unwelcome imposter syndrome passenger is celebrate your achievements, no matter how small. Keeping a success journal can help remind you of your accomplishments when doubt creeps in. The other thing I like to have my clients do, something that you can try, is write down all the times in the past when you've been successful. So you can remind yourself of these stories when you start to fall down into a dark hole. There is no reason why you can't be successful now because you have been successful in the past. Finally, pay attention to your morning and evening rituals. What is the first and last thing that you're thinking about? Make sure those thoughts are positive to support your efforts. To recap, imposter syndrome can be a significant barrier to feeling fulfilled and confident in your leadership role. But remember, it's not an indicator of your actual abilities or accomplishments. Like Dave and many others, you can overcome these feelings by taking deliberate steps towards recognizing your worth and capabilities. In short, you hold the power. As we wrap up today's episode, I encourage you to reflect on your journey, acknowledge your feelings, and take proactive steps to overcoming them. Leadership is not about being perfect. It's about leading with authenticity, making thoughtful decisions, and learning from each experience. Thanks for listening to The Happy Leader. If you would like more information about me, Amy Sanchez, and our executive coaching and team leadership services at Swim Against the Current, visit swim-against.com. And if you liked this podcast, help others who could use the support find it by giving us a rating. Until next time, life is short. Stay happy.